If you're searching for the best neighborhoods in Charleston, South Carolina, but you're just not necessarily moving here full time, this video is perfect for you. Maybe you've been coming to Charleston for years and you finally reached the point where you're thinking, why don't we just own something here? Or maybe you're looking at it a little more strategically. Maybe you want a place you can enjoy now and possibly rent, maybe eventually turn it into your primary home. Maybe, just maybe you've got a son or a daughter going to the College of Charleston or the medical university. If so, there's just a lot to digest. And those buyers need to look at Charleston just a little differently than somebody who's simply relocating here for a job. And so today, I'm gonna show you all the areas I'd put on your list. And more importantly, why I would put them there. But instead of ranking them from number 1 to number 6, I'm just gonna tell you who I think each area makes sense for. Let's start with downtown Charleston because this is where a lot of second home buyers naturally start, and I understand why, and I help many folks do the same thing. And it's always the kind of same vision of, like, owning in Charleston and coming into town on a Thursday afternoon, parking the car, barely touching it again until Sunday. Downtown is just hard to beat for that. And you can walk to dinner, you can walk to coffee. You've got King Street, the Battery, restaurants, galleries, churches, and parks. Charleston just literally outside your front door. And for that buyer who doesn't need a big yard anymore, downtown condo, smaller historic property, all that can make sense. But there are trade-offs. Parking matters, flooding matters, insurance matters. Historic properties, are going to require a lot more maintenance as well. And, if you're thinking you're simply just going to buy a condo downtown and put it on Airbnb whenever you're gone, you're going to need to investigate that before you buy and not afterwards, as Charleston just has very specific and area-wide specific short-term rental regulations. So downtown can be fantastic, but you just need to buy the right property for the way you actually plan to use it. The second area I'd look at is Mount Pleasant. And this is, you really get a good, interesting combination in Mount Pleasant. You're close to downtown, you're close to Sullivan's Island, the Isle of Palms. You've got great shopping, restaurants, medical facilities, and the everyday conveniences, but you can still have that neighborhood environment as well. And for a second home buyer or future retirement buyer, I particularly look at places where you can reduce the amount of maintenance you're taking on, and that might mean a condo, a townhome, or just a smaller house, or a neighborhood where you're not buying a giant property that just because you can. I see people make that mistake a lot. They've spent 25, 30 years maintaining the big family house, and the kids finally move out, and then they come to Charleston and look to buy another 3,500 square foot house. So, but why would you do it if this is supposed to be, making your life easier? So, let's buy accordingly. And areas in Mount Pleasant like Old Village and Ion can offer a tremendous Charleston lifestyle, although, they're going to come with some very different price points and property types. And then further north now, Mount Pleasant, you get generally, newer homes, new construction neighborhoods. So Mount Pleasant just gives you a lot of choices. But now I want to take a second, though, just to share a nugget of info. And if you've seen my other videos, you've seen or heard me talk about it there, but it's about property taxes here in the state of South Carolina. And the impact is pretty great when you're buying a second home here, as property taxes are assessed in 2 ways here. If your property is a primary residence, you're going to be assessed at 4%. If the property is a second home or an investment property, you're assessed at a 6% rate. And that is just a big spread financially. So it's something to plan into your cost. And if you'll stick around to the end, I'll give you some additional tax info and how potentially your college student living here can save you some money on your taxes. Now let's talk Daniel Island. And I think Daniel Island deserves a serious look. It's planned, it's attractive. You've got walking and biking opportunities, restaurants and businesses right there within the island, and it's relatively convenient, to both downtown Charleston and Mount Pleasant. And it's also an area where somebody could buy today as a second home and realistically see themselves, using it more and more as they get closer to retirement. And that's actually something I want you to be thinking about throughout this video. Don't only ask yourself, does this work for 2026? But could this still work for us in 2031 or 2036? Because you may be making a much longer term decision than you realize. And before I totally forget, if we haven't met, my name is Jason Carton, and I'm with Carolina One Real Estate here in Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up here on Sullivan's Island and in Mount Pleasant during the 70s and 80s, and I can offer tons of insight like only a local can. I'll give you the straight skinny on everything Charleston, and you can also get my free Charleston, South Carolina relocation guide. And this one's actually made specifically for those looking to buy second homes here in Charleston, so you don't want to miss that. So, and again, that's in the description. So back to the discussion. Now we're going to change lifestyles completely. And if you want Charleston because you want the beach, Isle of Palms needs to be in the conversation. And this isn't the buyer who primarily wants to walk King Street every night. This is the buyer who wants to wake up and wants to walk the beach in the morning. Maybe you've got grown kids and eventually grandkids coming to visit. Maybe this becomes really the family gathering place. And maybe you want a property that feels like vacation just every time you're here. And that is a completely different objective. But let me say, beachfront and island ownership introduces another group of questions, and that is insurance. You know, wind and hail, flood coverage, salt air maintenance. That's a big deal here, and even rental restrictions. There's also HOA rules if you're buying a condo in a community there. So, and if you are looking, drop a comment. I can help out with all that information because that is part of your overall carrying costs for sure. That's why I just don't want you comparing purchase prices. A $900,000 property in one part of Charleston and a $900K property somewhere else may have very different annual ownership costs. And just one more thing on the Isle of Palms before we leave is, you know, this is really like the last place or the last great frontier, if you will, for short-term rentals. You can basically do what you want with the short-term rentals there. But if you have any questions on that as well, you can drop me a comment in below. I'm pretty well versed on the regs around town. James Island doesn't always get talked about as much with second home buyers, but I wouldn't overlook it. And the reason why is location, location, location. You know, you're between downtown Charleston and Folly Beach, you know, and there are just some buyers who really just don't want to be in the middle of it, want to be in a more normal situation. And, you know, they want to feel like they live here. They want to feel like they're in our neighborhood. They want to go downtown for dinner one night and maybe Folly Beach for the next. James Island can give you all that. This is especially interesting for somebody who sees the property potentially transitioning from second home to primary residence. I've lived on James Island myself, and it is really just a great way of living in Charleston. You're really just close to everything. And here's one category I think, you know, we're going to talk about a bunch on this channel, and that is parents with children attending the College of Charleston, because every year I hear the same version of this question is, you know, we're going to be spending a lot of money here over the next 4 years. Should we consider buying something? And, you know, sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's not, but it's definitely worth running the numbers. And what's especially interesting to me is when the parents already like Charleston, you know, now the conversation changes. Maybe your child uses the property for several years. Maybe eventually a sibling does. Maybe maybe you keep it afterwards. Maybe it becomes your Charleston place. You know, maybe you just, you know, keep it down the road for yourselves. And, you know, that's very different from buying a random investment property in the city you've never really visited. But proximity to campus, parking, condo rules, rental rules, property taxes, insurance, and what happens after graduation all need to be considered before you decide whether it makes sense. And I'm going to have an entire video series specifically for people with kids here at the College of Charleston or MUSC, so look out for that. But let me leave you with what I think the biggest mistake first-time second home buyers make here. And they try to find the best neighborhood in Charleston, and there just, you know, isn't one. There's a best neighborhood for what you want to do with the property. If your perfect Charleston weekend is walking to dinner every night, I'd point you one direction. If you want the beach, you're going somewhere else. If you want something easy that could eventually become your retirement home, that's another conversation. And if we're buying partly because your son or daughter is at the College of Charleston, we're going to evaluate that property completely different. And that's where working backward from your lifestyle really matters here. And one other thing you need to know before buying a second home here is really don't estimate your taxes based on what somebody else who uses the home as their primary residence is paying. A non-primary residence here is, generally treated differently for property tax purposes. And, that difference needs to be part of your budget. And if you're considering buying a second home here in Charleston, whether this is like in a year or 2 or 3 years from now, reach out to me, drop a comment below, and just tell me what you want the property to do. I can give you some insight on any area of town. You don't need to know which neighborhood yet. That's my job. We'll look backward from the lifestyle, the budget, and the long-term plan and figure out which parts of Charleston really make sense for you. And again, this is Jason Carton with Carolina One Real Estate. I'm right here in the Mount Pleasant office and just grew up here, can offer tons of insight. And my next video should be coming right here.